Here we are. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this very exciting event this evening. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you. And my name's Bianca. I'm an events host for Avid Reader, and tonight we are introducing the debut launch and in conversation event of Josephine Taylor in conversation with Lee Kofman. And we're going to be discussing Josephine's new book, her first novel, Eye of a Rook. So please join me firstly from wherever you may be to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. From where I call home, Meanjin, I pay respect to the Yagara and Turrbal people and to all elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that this land has always been and will always be a place of creativity, community and storytelling. Now, firstly, as I mentioned before, I'm doing the housekeeping this evening, so that means our guests can sit back and relax and you get to enjoy the show, the conversation. I'll be in the background and I'll be organising the tech side of things. So if you haven't attended an online event with Avid Reader before, there is a chat function that you can use to communicate with your host, myself. And when we call for audience questions, this is where you can type them in so that I can read them out loud. Please feel free to send through your questions at any time. All attendees are placed on mute for the conversation. However, at the end, I'll allow everyone to unmute themselves so we can join in thanking Josephine and Lee. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lee first of all as our in conversation guest, and Lee's going to take it from there. So Dr. Lee Kofman is the author of 5 books, including memoirs Imperfect, brought out in 2019 by Affirm Press, which was shortlisted for the NIB Literary Award, and co-editor of Rebellious Daughters, 2016 Ventura Press, and editor of Split. Again, a very busy year for you, Lee, was 2019. And Split was longlisted for the ABIA Awards in 2020. Anthologies of personal essays by prominent Australian authors. Her short works have been widely published in Australia, UK, Scotland, Israel, Canada, and the US. A very warm Avid Reader welcome to you both. And Lee, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Bianca. That was such a lovely introduction. Now I'm so excited to be talking about Josephine's book tonight, Eye of a Rook. This is a remarkable novel. I'll tell you in a minute why I think so. But I also want to say that even though this is Josephine's debut book, she's actually not a novice at all to the literary world. Her writing has been published and anthologized widely, including in Australian Book Review, Southerly, and Text. She's an associate editor at the highly regarded literary magazine that many of you will be familiar with, Westerly, and she's also a lecturer at Edith Cowan University, where she teaches fiction and creative nonfiction. She's also a former psychotherapist, which I suspect is something that contributed to her writing, and I would like to talk to her about this if we have enough time. When Josephine asked me to do this conversation with her, I was really thrilled. What a great opportunity this is to engage deeper with a book that hasn't lingered with me since after I read it a year ago. To begin with, I love its narrative ambition. It explores with nuance and depth how profoundly chronic pain, vulvodynia in this instance, can reshape a person's life, particularly with the suffering which is not visible and bound with social shame. Eye of a Rook is at once a moving personal tale and a sharp critique of patriarchal structures that amplify individual suffering. Not only that, but Josephine's story navigates smoothly different times, places, narrators, even genres, I think. A story of a contemporary Australian woman is woven with that of a 19th century married couple in England to show how in both of these otherwise very different societies, women's pain and women's bodies more generally can be misunderstood and treated with suspicion. Yet while Josephine delivers a sharp critique of misogyny, being the fine writer that she is, she avoids making sweeping generalizations, affording as much dignity to her male narrator as she does to the female characters. What particularly stayed with me is the visceral quality of Josephine's prose. The renowned novelist E.L. Doktorov once suggested that good writing is supposed to evoke sensation in the reader, not the fact that it's raining, but the feeling of being rained upon. In Al-Farouk, it rains all the time, metaphorically speaking, that is. Josephine doesn't write about the body, but writes from the rawness of the flesh itself, efforts that breathe, ache, pulsate. Her language echoes the many faces pain as well as desire can assume. Her bold linguistic choices, especially where suffering is concerned, render the experiences of her characters so specific and palpable that I literally kept squirming and fidgeting as I read this book. The last thing I want to say is that Al-Farouk is an intricate exploration of the havoc our body can wreak with us, but it is also a study of the meaning of art in our lives, as well as of marriage and friendship. And the way I read this book, what underlies its richness is the fundamental question of how we are to live best this one brief life we have, a life guaranteed to be marked by suffering to a greater or lesser extent. So there's a lot to talk about in this book. And this is also Josephine's first event. So I'm very honored to be part of it, Josephine. And I want to, actually, before I start my question, I just want to remind you that you also can, as Bianca was saying, post your questions at any time. And we'll have about 15 minutes at the end to ask Josephine whatever you would like. There's so much to discuss. But Josephine, I want to start from the title of your wonderful novel. And this title also inspires this cover. Look at this cover. I think it's a really great artwork. Yeah, Bianca is showing you. So, Josephine, do you feel that the title somehow expresses the heart of your work?
Yeah, I also just want to say that that was an amazing introduction, Lee. It's so lovely to hear somebody talk about your book in such an intelligent way and to understand the main sort of thrust of the book so well. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate you being available tonight to talk with me. It's great. Look, yeah, once upon a time, Rook was Silk Purse, just as a working title. And a silk purse does make its appearance in both the timelines, in the Victorian England timeline and in the contemporary Perth timeline. So it's a way of kind of linking those two timelines. But it seemed it's an obvious thing of, the female genitals, but it was kind of a little too explicit. And so I moved away from that. And then I was reading Tom Brown's School Days, which was set at rugby school. I was doing that for research for the book because young Arthur Rochdale goes to rugby school. And there were some rooks circling. And that entered into a pivotal scene when Arthur is told some devastating news. And then I found that rooks just started to crop up spontaneously in the writing as I was writing it. Without me really meaning to. And then I discovered I had a scene where Arthur was walking through London. That's sorry, I'm around the wrong way, map of London here that Arthur walks through in that time. The map's from 1868. And I learned that the slums that he was going along the edges of were also called rookeries. And so there were a whole lot of things that happened. The Rook became really a way of seeing where Arthur was at, a bit of a metaphor for where he was with struggling with his wife's, with Emily's pain and the decisions that needed to be made. Then I discovered when we came to publishing the book that I couldn't call it Rook or The Rook because there were too many rooks. So I had to call it something else. So already there was this idea of Arthur being seen in the eye of a rook, and I kind of went back to that. I actually didn't really need to do a great deal. It sort of connects with Alice, who has vulvodynia as well, researches the history of hysteria and vulvar pain, and she works with this idea of two bodies. And so the Rook, I won't go into all of it, but basically the idea of a fragmented sensation-driven body and the whole body that we see when we look at ourselves in a reflection and so on. And that tied in with the Rook and the reflection and the eye of a Rook. So yes, it ended up being the perfect title. It took a long time to get to it.
I've been thinking, Josephine, as I was listening to you, where was I all my life? I've never heard about any other book called anything to do with rooks in the title. Obviously, I'm not well read enough. Interestingly, I read the your title is a bit of a metaphor also to what is happening to Alice, your contemporary protagonist, as she keeps writing her novel. So for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of the novel, Arthur is a protagonist of Alice's novel, and in most of the stories, the vulvodynia is the main theme. And I kind of thought maybe Eye of a Rook also refers to Alice's process of starting to look at her condition from above rather than sort of...
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll stop you before you go too far down that track, though. But yes, absolutely. It is because of the spoilers that goes into. But yes, it's very much connected with that whole idea of the perspective as well, and to do with creativity. Yes. And the creative response to pain.
Yeah, sure. So we started talking about the vulvodynia itself, and Josephine, I know that you've spoken about this in public already, but you share the same diagnosis. So would you mind please telling us a little bit about the condition,
Sure.
what are the symptoms, etc.?
Yeah. So vulvodynia is chronic vulvar pain lasting 3 months or longer, and it can manifest in various forms. It's unexplained, largely because of the lag in medical knowledge. It can manifest as localized, provoked pain around the entrance to the vagina, which is called vestibulodynia, because that entrance is the vestibule, right through to spontaneous, generalized, constant pain around all of the genitals. And it's much more common than people realize, and this is part of why I wrote this book. It's part of why I wrote my thesis. It's part of why I wrote this book, is because I was really angry. I was angry on my own behalf, because I think that there's this fundamentally there's an incredible discrepancy between the prevalence of the disorder and knowledge and awareness around it. So certainly there's been quite a lot of research carried out now, and somewhere between 10 and 28% of all women will experience unexplained chronic vulvar pain or discomfort at some point during their life. And that can range from like just ongoing discomfort during intercourse or pressure to the area, right through to really debilitating constant pain. The other thing is too that was seen largely in terms of being a sexual disorder, but it's being more understood, and certainly my experience and the experience of countless other women is, if I can speak for them, is that it's largely a pain disorder, but because of where it is, it affects your sexuality. So it's very easy, I think, given the history of hysteria, Freud, etc., to jump into the sexual dysfunction kind of wagon. But it's really a bit like having a lot of tension in your neck, leading to a headache, that kind of thing. The other thing is that there can be a lot of causes of it as well. So I've had contact with many women now, and the causes are really various. So you can have women who've had repair work after childbirth, or an impact, or who've had chronic candida, so that the tissue becomes so sensitized it reacts to only a small kind of disturbance in that area, in the environment there. You can have pelvic floor dysfunction, and unfortunately what happens with a lot of these dermatological, there's so many causes, is that often what ends up happening is that the muscles tense to guard against the pain. That kind of starts the nerves become dysregulated, and you end up with a kind of faulty loop that happens. So I think that's the main qualities of vulvodynia. More and more is being understood about it. But if you think even in terms of, like, say you look at 16%, which is a figure that's often given, and you somebody check my maths, but is that maybe like 2 million women who will experience this at some point? And even if it's the point simply that it affects your sex life or your, you know, ease with which you might go to wear tight trousers or whatever it might be, these can have profound effects on you, depending on your age too.
Despite the commonality, Josephine, you show in your book how profoundly this condition misunderstood by medical establishments. I really like how you move between two different centuries, the 19th and the 21st, and show how we sort of advanced, but maybe not so much advanced in terms of understanding this condition. So would you mind telling us a little bit why you decided to set your novel in these two different times and have things changed?
Sure. Well, really, I again, the PhD preceded this, and my PhD was an investigative memoir. So I did a lot of research into the history of vulvar pain, the history of hysteria, and I found that vulvar pain's kind of been there throughout recorded history. And I found that in the 19th century, it was a really interesting time because it seemed that, well, I encountered Isaac Baker-Brown for a start, who was a real life surgeon who is in the book and who advises his terrible surgery for Emily. So I encountered him, and his work was really barbaric in terms of treating women surgically for things like hysteria, what they called hysteria, epilepsy, idiocy. He saw this kind of tiered effect of which began with masturbation, though they called it peripheral irritation, that kind of went down until you would die eventually. And so he was basically curing women. This is what his idea was, that by performing clitoridectomies, he was curing women. And I kind of wince a little bit myself as I talk about this, because I know this is really confronting subject matter. But I guess what you might imagine as I talk about it is that as I kind of read more and more and saw that many of the women that he treated actually just seemed to have vulvar pain, or maybe they had like an infection, or maybe they were a little bit kind of depressed. One of them had lost a baby. And yet he would often, without even telling them necessarily what was going to happen, without them being fully informed, he would operate. But also at the same time, and Alice writes about this, so Alice is kind of me, except a lot younger and with some vital differences too. She hasn't had kids. She doesn't have the psychological background and so on. But she takes the kind of the same sort of track that I did in researching. I could only put a little bit of my research in there. But what she finds as she researches is that there were people who in the 19th century who were actually describing this, who were saying, my patient, touching her with the edge of a feather was like as if she were cut by a knife. They were coming out with these very, very strong, accurate descriptions of what women with vulvodynia experience. More importantly, they were doing it with no distrust. They were doing it with they completely believed the women, and they were mystified and wanted to help them. So then what happened, and this is what I discover, what Alice discovers, and why it was important, I guess, to have the setting in the 19th century, is that really Freud came along, and Alice's ambivalence towards Freud is a lot like my own. There's a lot that I think is very valuable in what he brought to the world. However, in terms of this particular disorder, the influence of Freud, the distortion of his ideas, they were taken up by psychiatry, gynecology, and then women were starting to be, in the 1960s and 1970s, medical articles were coming out with women with this have psychological causation. They're finding a secondary gain from having this illness. It's a defense mechanism against having intercourse. and so on. So the onus was really on the woman. It wasn't on medical knowledge. It was, this is the woman's fault, basically, even if she doesn't know it herself. And that kind of actually has a bit of a hangover as well of treating women like they need to be protected from things as well, which is very much the 19th century. So there hasn't actually been a lot of steps forward. I think the last 10 years, things are really starting to move. There's a lot of action in the United States. There's some terrific organisations and so on. But I still encounter a lot of women who on Facebook groups would have say, oh, I was told it was in my head. I've been told I should do this, I should do that. Just not knowing anything about it. And my experience too, when I was researching it over a decade ago, was that all the women that contacted me hadn't spoken to anybody else, and they were saying exactly the same thing about the pain. So I was frustrated and angry. I just don't like inefficiency. I don't like unnecessary suffering. You can see with Alice that she goes along, she tries to get diagnosed. It takes many, many months to be diagnosed. And also she's asked to do things like use certain kinds of creams and so on, which make it worse. And the problem is that unless you're seeing people who know what they're doing, it can make it worse. So yeah, a lot hasn't changed. A lot of the attitudes haven't changed. In some ways we regressed, and we're now starting to catch up again. I think we kind of went down this sort of Freudian cul-de-sac, and yeah, here we are.
Speaking of Freud, I was just sort of trying to imagine, I was listening to you, Josephine. What if there was a male equivalent of vulvodynia? What would have Freud made of it then? So
Okay.
do we take women's pain differently than we sort of think about men's pain?
I think we do, but the other thing I'd say is that there is a male equivalent of vulvodynia. Yeah. So this is the interesting thing, and this is what also kind of challenges, I think, the history and the way that these disorders have been seen, that it doesn't matter whether you're male, female, transitioning, intersex, whatever, people can, of any sexuality, can have pain in that region. So in men, it's typically in the past, one of the diagnoses was, what was it? Non-bacterial prostatitis, for instance. So John Anderson, who I think used to be the deputy PM, he actually resigned. One of the reasons he gave for resigning was this pain that he had that was made worse by stress and sitting, which is exactly the same as what I have. So yeah, I think that exactly, I know. So I do think that a lot more women, just from what I'm hearing and seeing, and I have spoken with men who have it as well, but only a few. So I suspect there's a lot more women with this pain. And of course, it ties in with other pelvic pain syndromes, with endometriosis, with interstitial cystitis, with irritable bowel syndrome. So there's a lot of overlap. In fact, Kylie Maslin, who wrote Show Me How It Hurts, about her experience with endometriosis and culture, she also has vulvodynia as part of that. So there's this incredible overlap in our bodies, within our bodies, between our bodies, and so on. And it really sort of undoes that kind of patriarchal binaried model, and also the Freudian idea of that the mature, psychologically, sexually mature woman, it's pleasure is with intercourse, vaginal orgasm, not clitoral orgasm. And it also fits in with the history, the centuries of hysteria, where women were, when they weren't understood, was seen, they're either hypersexual, we need to sort of corral and tame their sexuality, or they were frigid, they needed to be kind of, the idea was always to kind of, she needs to be married and having relations with her husband. So there's so much to unpack about vulvodynia.
Of course. And we only started unpacking it in terms of, I mean, it's fascinating, the history of it and all the research that you've done, as well as, of course, having your lived experience. But what I want to reiterate yet again is how extraordinary you are when you write pain, because I think I teach writing, and I think one of the most difficult things that I see time after time in people's writing, the most difficult things is to articulate bodily sensations, because bodily sensations so often resist words and they resist language. And yet in your book is really not only describes them viscerally and vividly, but also with a great nuance. You really show so masterfully how you distinguish between different types of pain. And when you write about sex, you do a very similar thing as well. You show the pleasure of sex really exquisitely and palpably. So I want to sort of, speaking of the artistic side of your book, Josephine, I asked Josephine before this conversation if she would mind reading to us just a very little excerpt from the book, and I asked her to read some passage which she particularly struggled to write. And then if you don't mind to talk about the struggle as well after you read.
Sure.
Whatever.
Thank you for all those, the words about the visceral experience. I'm really, one of the biggest compliments I'm being paid at the moment is that it actually hurts some people to read it. I know, yeah. And people experienced increased symptoms if they have pain syndromes, which I don't like people to hurt, clearly. I think James Mackenzie Watson on James and Ashley's Stay at Home podcast, he said that it actually, he had to go away from the book at times because it was increased pain. So that's a good thing in a way, because I want people to know what it's like, because if people are able to feel that or empathise with it, then they might also be more moved to do something about it, to learn more about it and so on. And also the other thing is in what you were saying about sexuality is that I really wanted to undo or challenge this notion of women having sexual issues before having vulvodynia. And there's no doubt that I'm sure that abuse may well predispose to different things, including guarding, vaginismus and so on, and pain. But I also know that so many women that Alice encounters also are just uninhibited, they're just normal people. So I really wanted to show with both Emily and Arthur in the Victorian era, and with Alice and her husband Duncan, that their sexual lives were very healthy, very joyful, uninhibited, and so on. So this, I thought I'd say that because this goes down a slightly different track. And this is in London in November 1865. And Arthur, we see the Victorian timeline from Arthur's perspective, with just his wife Emily's letters to his sister. So this is from Arthur's perspective, and he's just with Emily's father, so his father-in-law Charles. And they're talking about Emily's disorder, that they still don't know what's happening with her. And then I finish with just one letter from Emily. The men walked to the smoking room, the Reeds' new smoking room in their new and fancier home in this newly fashionable street. Harley Street, Emily's father told him when they were looking to move from Savile Row, and the desired location, as close to Cavendish Square as we can get. One thing about Charles, he has never hidden his ambition or his social aspirations. Well, he got what he wanted. With this and his flourishing practice, the country estate, his daughter's successful marriage, he has surely secured a permanent place in society. Now, Charles shrugs on his smoking jacket and allows the butler to light his cigar with the flickering candle. Their forms on the wall leap and dwindle. Successful, their successful marriage. But how do you count success? Has Emily told you of her early troubles? Another characteristic of his father-in-law, the abrupt beginnings, the taking charge. You mean the family loss? Arthur sinks into the armchair. I mean the symptoms she had. Her menses commenced at the same time as the loss, you know. It's uncomfortable to hear these intimate details from Emily's father. Arthur has to remind himself that Charles is a physician, and such words are his stock in trade. Still, he feels their intrusion. Charles fills the pause, counting off items on his definite pink fingers. headaches, anxiety, fatigue, palpitations, a weak liver, a loose kidney perhaps, globus hystericus. Arthur does not know the meaning of globus hystericus, but the sound of the last word alerts him to the direction his father-in-law is taking. She was not simply suffering with a terrible grief, or perhaps experiencing the difficult but normal changes of a girl becoming a woman. He knows he is out of his depth, yet Charles's words feel wrong to him. When Emily told him of those terrible years, all the elements of her suffering made sense. But, he reminds himself, he is no expert. That's what I determined at the time, but now I'm not so sure. Charles puffs out his smoke. Such nervous problems can indicate a certain moral instability. They can resurface, you know, and often in a more pronounced form, more dangerous. Instability? It is a strong word, an ugly word, with implications beyond his mind's compass. There is a man who deals with such problems, Charles says, a surgeon. What possible reason can there be for surgery? Charles looks uncomfortable for the first time. He believes that moral education is not enough in some instances. Then, in his usual resounding voice, he is impressive, audacious, and very skillful, so I'm told. Education in what? And audacious? Arthur can hardly imagine what that might mean. But what does the treatment involve? Here he was not clear. Gentle women were present at the meeting I attended. Charles taps the side of his nose. Must protect their delicate sensibility. It seems odd to talk about cures while offering such little information. Well, yes, but he has an impressive list of supporters, you know, tip-top people. It's the kind of thing that wins over his father-in-law, the approval of society. He's a pioneer in ovariotomy, uses methods that others have avoided in risky operations, and now he's president of the Medical Society of London. As for these experiments in this new procedure, he's been publishing on this for some years now. Experiments? The word is hardly reassuring. You must understand how we use such words. Charles speaks with satisfaction through a plume of smoke. All surgery involves risks, and he has extended an open invitation, you know, to physicians, surgeons, so I can observe this operation, be properly informed. Some positive action, that's the ticket. He hates the way the words roll so glibly from Charles's tongue, as if such terrible suffering might be removed in an instant, and the implied criticism, as if Emily is not wanting to get better, as if he and she are not doing all they possibly can. And he thinks of his friend Tom, who has warned against ill-considered action. Maybe we should continue to wait and see, Tom said when he confided that Emily's symptoms remained unchanged. It's important to avoid precipitous or ill-considered action. The different impulses jostle in him. Tom does not have to live with this suffering, be helpless in response, fail the person he loves most in the world. Charles does not have to watch his daughter suffer after calamitous treatments. As for him, no one knows how much he longs for certainty, to urge Emily to try harder, to ignore her pain, how he dreads falling back into the weakness of his boyhood. But no one knows either how her cries of pain tear at his heart. And yet, but still, maybe we should wait, he says, try further rest at Hurdley. He holds his father-in-law's eye. I'll be able to be there for some weeks. I will know if she does not improve and if more action is necessary. Think on it, Arthur. I would urge this treatment before the condition becomes ingrained. A short letter from Emily straight after that. November 26, 1865. Dear B, so Arthur has written to you of this Isaac Baker-Brown. No, I do not know the details of the operation, do not understand what logic it is based in. Arthur himself is not clear. Like me, he cannot understand how surgery could cure such a stubborn and widespread malaise. Though we are too uncomfortable to share our concerns in the way we once did, too estranged from each other altogether, though I will not say more, knowing how, even though you understand our dilemma, this distresses you. My father seems to know a good deal, but pulls back when I ask him and says, Arthur should make an appointment, and then you will know. It all makes me terribly uncertain and uneasy. What I do know is that it would be folly for me to make decisions affected as I am by pain and confusion, folly to resist the advice of those who surely know better than me. I have no choice but to place my trust in my father and my husband, and this I have resolved to do. Emmy.
Thank you, Josephine. I love this excerpt, and I love the fine psychological insight that you have into both husband and wife and they sort of very, very troubled decision making or trying to make decisions. Can you tell us just briefly why this particular passage was very difficult to write?
So it was like other passages in that I had all these ideas I wanted to convey. So there's a lot of ideas behind everything that's in there. So I really had to work hard to restrain myself, to not explain things and to not give more detail. And I found that what I did with that, and as all fiction writers would know, but I was learning how to write fiction as I wrote this. So I was learning as I went, and I had the wonderful Susan Medallia as my mentor. So she was extraordinary in helping me in that process. What I learned was, okay, create the character. So it was really, okay, I've got to really create Charles more. I need to understand him. I need for him to have definite pink fingers. I need him to use a particular word, you know. I need him to be kind of take charge, and I needed certain characteristics. I needed Arthur, and that's why I gave so much of Arthur's childhood, to be sensitive, to be open to the idea of interacting with his wife quite strongly, and so on. So I learned through writing the fiction that I had to create the characters and the scene. And once I'd created that and put them to the two men in that room, and you probably all know this, is that they then just come to life, and they talk about the things that you're thinking about. So that was one thing. And so I did struggle a bit with that dialogue, and I struggled with, you know, pulling myself out of it, letting them talk. The other thing I struggled with was that kind of that interaction between the different voices. So that was why I read that little letter there as well. The kind of balance of the letters from Emily and Arthur's thread and Alice's thread. And I worked hard to sort of to see where they would place best. You probably noticed that when Alice is at her worst, Emily and Arthur are very happy, and excuse me. And then when Emily is at her worst, Alice is going to the support group and so on. So there was a lot of balancing of those kinds of things. I think I also, with what I struggled with this was Emily's voice a little, because I really wanted her to be realistic, and that in that she expresses her dependency upon the men in her life. I didn't like doing that. But in a way, it was a bit of a feminist maneuver, because I really wanted to indicate that this was actually quite standard. This is what the kind of history we're pushing against. So even though at times I really wanted to grab her and say, stop, you don't need to do this, you know, speak up, I had to let her find her way as well. So yeah.
I loved about about your novel too, Josephine, how you did not try to sort of construct the historical part of your novel with our modern mindset, but I can actually, and you can show us how women can be strong, and even how strong women are caught in such circumstances, and what they can do and can't do. Now, we unfortunately it's too soon. We're nearing this annoying time when I have to soon you went to the audience question, and I have still millions of questions I want to ask Josephine. So if Bianca, if that's all right, if you could indulge me with one more last question before I hand over to you. I want to talk a little bit, since we're already talking about the writing itself, I want to talk a little bit about creativity as a theme in the novel, Josephine. So you show one, so I think we already know very well, Alice is a writer as well as academic with your background. And you show beautifully how creativity can be really impacted by illness, by pain, but also how it can then play a role in resilience. So maybe if you could just talk about this sort of dual relationship.
Sure. It's something I learned myself. So I really battled against vulvodynia for about 10 years. And then gradually, it was a gradual process, and then I started to try to listen to it and to see where it would take me. And Alice has a similar kind of trajectory, though hers is a lot, excuse me, I'll have to have a sip of water.
Want some of mine?
So hers is a lot shorter than mine was, but she, like me, she has this sense of urgency, and she's angry. And because she's a writer and she's an academic, it's really natural for her to go down that pathway, to start to research, to start to write personal essays, which is what I did as well. But also what I was gesturing towards with creativity in this novel was that often disorder is not just, and I've spoken with this elsewhere, about this elsewhere, but disorder is not just about our past. We focus on our past a lot, but it is also about the future. And when you have this level of struggle in your life, you really have a choice about what you do with it. And I'm not saying everyone should go out and write a book. I mean, everyone finds their own way, but you have to form a relationship with it. I had the relationship of an enemy for a long time. But I found that being creative, and this is what Alice finds as well, once she starts to write more and become more creative, she finds that her perception of her life changes, and she starts to become a new person, which is what then places stress upon her marriage with Duncan, because he resists that so strongly. But I think it's critical personally. I think it's critical if you have something that is debilitating, that you find your own way to that place of being able to be creative with it in whatever form that takes, you know, small or large, whatever it might be. So that's something I feel quite passionate about as well.
Thank you so much, Josephine. Bianca, I'll hand over to you, but if there's not enough question for some reasons, I'll be surprised, but I can always fill in.
Yeah, no problems. We have had a couple. Yeah, we've had 3 questions so far. So that's, yeah, it depends how complex the answers are, I suppose, but we'll just see how we go. We have got a fair amount of time still. And I've been just enjoying the conversation. I've found it so fascinating. So thank you both so much. Okay, now Ashley got in really early with her question. So she must have had a burning question. Ashley wanted to know, Josephine, did you find that you had to learn more about biology and medicine than you ever thought you would need in the course of getting a diagnosis and understanding the condition and its history?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ashley. I really did. I thought, because most of the doctors that I went to didn't actually have any idea, but usually they would say, they would try different things. They wouldn't say they didn't have any idea, excuse me, but they would try different things. It's great when a doctor does say, we actually don't know. And I've spoken with Ashley about that before. But no, I did have to, in order to understand it, because nobody else did, I had to do a lot of research. I've got lever arch files over there, full of medical articles, full of copies of Netter's Atlas. I studied the anatomy of the pelvis. I drew the pelvis. I learned the names of all the muscles and the ligaments and the bones. I learned about stress and the body's reaction to stress. I learned about the brain. So I went into neurophysiology, neuropsychology. And it got to the point where when I would go to see a doctor, I would usually know more than them about what I was coming to see them for. So what then happened is that I really don't see doctors anymore in the sense that I'll see doctors for tests and diagnoses. And this isn't because I discount their knowledge. Some doctors have been amazing, but it's because I've learned how to manage my own pain in the best possible way. And I know the things to avoid and so on. And that's because I educated myself so thoroughly. I have had a little gap of research, and I set Alice deliberately in the period when I did my PhD so that I could just draw on all of the research I did then and didn't have to do more research. But more recently, I'm finding there are advances and so on, so I'm catching up a little bit with that. But no, it was a big learning curve in those areas, biology and anatomy and neurophysiology and all the rest.
And that leads really well into another question we've had about, I guess, the novel structure. So we've had a couple of really interesting questions in terms of, I guess, the mechanics of the novel, being that it's sort of, the fictional and non-fictional elements. Now, Helen has asked you, Jo, how did you decide on the novel structure, the 3 points of view, including the letters across 2 very different eras, and what were the challenges of telling a story in this way?
Thanks, Helen. I didn't really decide it in some ways. The very Arthur and Isaac Baker Brown just came to life one day when I was at a writing workshop. Theon Murphy gave us a writing prompt. I think there was a painting of a ship on the wall or something, and suddenly I'm in this Victorian room. And there's Isaac Baker Brown, who I knew quite well from studying him. And then there's this other man there, and this other man is saying Isaac Baker Brown about his wife. So that happened completely spontaneously. And I thought, whoa, okay. But I also really felt strongly that I wanted to bring in some kind of modern perspective. And I didn't want to just present this story from the past. I really wanted to let it find an impact and context in the modern day. And so the easiest way of doing that was to have a female protagonist who was similar to me in some ways, but very different to me in others, who could draw on the kinds of, I guess, the research and so on I'd done. But I also made her younger, perhaps more susceptible to the influence of well, definitely more susceptible to the influence of her husband, and uncertain of herself. And also she hadn't had children. And so, because a lot of women with vulvodynia, that's an issue for them as well, having children. So I wanted that kind of age bracket, the 30s. And I deliberately used Arthur's perspective for the Victorian timeline narrative because I was really interested in how other people see vulvodynia. What's it like for the man? So even though he had arisen spontaneously, I stuck with him. I was very interested in kind of that slight remove, I guess, from my own experience. But at the same time, it felt as I went further along that it did need something of Emily in there. So I really had to think about how to do that. And I think I just started writing a letter in her voice one day, and it just came out very naturally. And this seemed to me to be the ideal way of her expressing herself, because the letters are written to Arthur's sister Bea, and initially they don't know each other. They become closer and closer. So you see her gradually unfolding, gradually relaxing, and able to tell sort of her deepest thoughts and fears without really understanding, because she's not given the information, as women weren't then, about really a lot of things, about money, about her health and so on. She was managed. But I really wanted that directness of her voice. And I didn't find it difficult writing the 3 of them. And the ways in which I did play with the structure a lot, but that actually didn't give me a massive headache. The last third of it, I had to, Susan and I, like, no, this isn't working. And so I had to redraft it fully, really 3 times, as well as editing all the time as well. But that was largely because the structure wasn't working. I was trying to make what happens about 2/3 of the way through. I was trying to make all the big revelations all happen at the end, and it was just wasn't working. So I had to kind of do that part of the way through, 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, with another little sort of, I guess, movement forward or revelation right at the end. So it took some time, but it was a really satisfying process. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, next question is from Jodie. Jodie's just wondering why you chose fiction for this story and not over non-fiction.
Thanks, Jodie. That was largely because I finished my PhD and couldn't get it published. So that was a memoir. And I think it's actually very good. And the people who read it thought it was good too. I did have a publisher say we all read it, we all loved it. But it was very much an unwieldy beast. It was full of theory, my experience. It probably would have needed a lot of work. And I tried for a little while, but I tend to lose confidence quite quickly in that kind of process. So I think, also that's right, I sent a personal essay actually to Susan Medalia, and she actually made the comment that, you know, this is before she was my mentor, and she said, you know, you could write fiction. You've got an amazing voice, but you could write fiction, you know, if you wanted to. And I was like, oh, okay, could I? And so when that story began, I just went with it. And I found it has actually given me a lot of freedom, much more freedom than writing memoir did, because it's such a delicate subject and it impacts on so many people. It meant that I could take the experience of all the women that I've interacted with, and I could bring that into the women in the support group and Alice and so on. I could represent them without feeling like, oh gosh, I feel bad about reporting what she said there. Or so there was a tremendous freedom in writing fiction, and it was just so exciting and pleasurable as well.
Yep, definitely. I caught on there to what you were saying about feeling a certain freedom, and that was definitely a question we did receive from Madeline, who's with us here tonight as well. And she, I don't know if you wanted to make a bit more comment on the kind of, she was asking about the kind of freedom you felt exploring this issue through fiction, which you didn't have in your thesis.
Look, I guess for a start, I felt freer. Well, continuing on, I also felt freer about how I dealt with Isaac Baker Brown as well. So, but I could develop him as well in ways that I didn't do or couldn't do in the memoir. Really there, I was just reporting what he did and what I read and so on. But here I could actually, even though he's a peripheral figure in many ways, he's pivotal. He's absolutely pivotal, because he's that choice that that Arthur and Emily need to make, is, does she have the operation? So it really gave me freedom to kind of play with him as a figure, and also to explore some of my own ambivalence about him as well, that he was human, even if really did terrible things. It really gave me a lot of freedom to go back into my past, my pommy past. Being born in England, and I interviewed my father, who passed away just before I finished writing this, who was, which fed into the ending of it and the creativity and so on. But in interviewing him, I could bring all of his life, some of his life at least, into Arthur's life. The climbing of the naze and walking with his little dog, and what happened to him at boarding school, which when you read the book, it did happen to Dad, pretty much just like that. So it gave me the freedom to be able to really go into Arthur and create Arthur. And in some ways to kind of, I don't know, it's like a gift to Dad as well, doing that.
Yeah, I saw that you've dedicated the book to him. Yeah. And we have Imbi here with us tonight, who has asked, she said, first of all, thank you, Josephine, for your honesty about the writing process for this book. How do you feel about having a book out in the world that's so closely tied to your personal experience?
Hi, Imbi. Lovely to have you here. Lovely to have everyone here. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. I think I got used to it. So I've had this now for 21 years, and I started talking about it I guess more publicly when I was doing my PhD thesis. So I started doing presentations. I think I did a presentation, me and my vulva, at one point. So I thought I'm just going to, and I just thought too, there's nothing to be ashamed of. There's absolutely, are people ashamed of their migraines? Do people think, oh, they've got a thinking disorder? No, they don't. The other thing that's happened is that each time I've presented, I've had people come up afterwards, usually saying, oh, my daughter has this, or, oh, I have a co-worker who I think has this. So I had a very big response in terms of direct feedback that I was connecting with a lot of people. So that was important. I felt that I was really making a difference in doing that. I also felt that every time I was initially really found it hard to present when there were men in the audience. So I had to really overcome that and get rid of that. And I found that every time I presented, people were just like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is well done. And this writing is incredible and so on. So I would gain confidence each time. And so I think that it's got to the point where I really don't care anymore. Like if somebody makes a judgment about it, then that's their issue. Because I know what I'm experiencing. I know what millions of women are experiencing. I know that things really need to be done about this. This is not right. This is not good. And the other thing is I feel a strong sense of responsibility to speak for women as well. For whatever reason, I seem able to do that. So I will do that. And particularly for women who've really, haven't gotten through or whatever, there has been that. And so, yeah, I think that the passion keeps me going. And so it's fine. It's okay for me to do it now.
And I certainly hope, we've had a lot of comments as well, just in terms of how in-depth, interesting, fascinating the conversation has been, but also what are you working on next? That has been, so Poppy has been, is our lucky last question. We've run out of time, but I'll squeeze one more question in. Yeah, Josephine, we might end with that one if that's okay with you, if you could comment on maybe what you're working on next.
Sure. Well, I haven't started it, but I've got a lot of ideas around it, and it might not end up even being a thing, but it is a study of a fiction, a novel, another complex. I seem to go for complex things with a lot of complex structure, exploring intergenerational trauma, genetics, epigenetics, and following a family over several centuries, including into the future. And looking at also, again, because this seems to be my thing, creativity and time, creativity, fate, genetics, and trauma.
Yep, wonderful. We certainly wish you all the best on behalf of Avid Reader, and I would like to say thank you and just appreciate your time so much, and congratulations on your book. First Zoom event, I believe, for the in terms of talking about the book. We've got a great podcast out there, an episode with Ashley Collegian Blunt, and yeah, so I advise everyone, if you can, go and read more and find out more about Josephine Taylor and Lee Kofman. Thank you both. Lee, you are on mute at the moment, but I just wanted to offer, if you did have any last words before we open it up to the crowd.
My only last words will be, please go and buy Josephine's book. Seriously, it's not just the topic, it's also you get such wonderful aesthetic experience of just really good, well-written piece of art.
Thanks so much, Lee. And thanks to Avid Reader too. I came to so many events last year. It sort of opened my literary world. So that was fantastic. So it was really lovely to be with you tonight as well.
Fabulous. Thank you. So for everyone here tonight, I have sent through a couple of times through the event in the chat function a link to where you can purchase Josephine's book, I Have a Rook, and also just where you can find out about more events that we're holding. You can sign up to our weekly newsletter and get them all direct to your inbox, which I find myself always continually registering for, and then I get asked to do one, so it's even better. It's been a pleasure, and I'm going to open it up to everyone. Now we can join in a round of applause. So I'll just, there we go. So you'll all be able to unmute, and we'll switch over now to gallery view. And
Hey, hi Mel. Hi Paul.
there's so many wonderful authors.
There is. Wow. Wow. Thanks everyone. That's lovely.
Thank you too for the support of, I believe Fremantle Press has joined us.
Yes.
Susan, Medalia, thank you.
Chloe. Hey Emma. Oh gosh. Hello. Thank you so much everyone for coming. Karen, hi. Fiona. Hello. Zoe, Germany.
All right, everyone, have a lovely night. Take care, and we'll see you next time. This event will also be uploaded on YouTube, on Avid Reader's YouTube channel in the coming week, so you'll be able to join us all again. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Helen, Annette, bye.
Bye, everyone.